All right, good afternoon. Thanks Yair for having me. Thanks James for the introduction. I'm going to talk about a book I wrote. It's about 3 or 4 years of research called Everybody Lies, and it's how you can use data to better understand people. And it's kind of about the power of data, though I'm in a room with 20% of the people wearing shirts saying I'm a data junkie, so I don't know if I need to convince you people that data is great. Maybe I should give an opposite talk about the dangers of data. But nonetheless, I'm going to talk about this book and the research I do. I was worked as a data scientist at Google and as a writer, a data journalist, and I tend to use data from the internet to better understand people. But I'm going to start with a story that doesn't have anything to do with the internet. It doesn't have anything to do with people. It's a story about a horse. This is American Pharoah. How many people know American Pharoah? Okay, so in 2015, American Pharoah became the first horse in 37 years to win the American Triple Crown. But when American Pharoah was 1 year old, he was up for an auction, and nobody knew that American Pharoah was a great racehorse. There was nothing particularly remarkable about American Pharoah. Nobody knew that except for this man, Jeff Sater. Jeff Sater's a guy, he has 3 degrees from Harvard University. But when he was 26 years old, he was working at Citibank. And he looked at himself in the mirror. He was wearing a suit and tie. And he looked at himself in the mirror. He said, "It's not me." And he quit his job and he moved to rural Pennsylvania. And he decided he loved horses and he was going to devote the rest of his life to trying to figure out what makes a great racehorse great, if he could figure that out. And he decided that he was going to, early on, this was before Moneyball, before data science, before the term big data existed. He was going to use data. He was going to try to build a model of great racehorses using data science. And he started doing many things to try to predict racehorse success. One of the first things he did, he measured the size of horse nostrils. He had a theory that bigger nostrils would allow horses to breathe better. And he sat outside the barn, measured the size of their nostrils. He built what is to this day the largest horse nostril data set ever assembled. And he put that in his computer, compared that to how horses eventually performed, and he found that that did not predict horse racing success. Jeff Sater's an eccentric guy. He once measured the volume of their fast... I'm missing one. He measured their volume of their fast twist muscles, made a little more sense, correlated that with how they eventually did, found that did not work. He's an eccentric guy. He once measured the size of their defecations. He tried to explain to me his theory for why this would make a racehorse great. I could not understand what he was saying. But he sat outside the barn, measured the size of horses' poop, put that into his Excel spreadsheet, correlated with that with how the horses eventually performed, and found that did not predict racehorsing success. So Jeff Sater was basically a total failure. He had quit his lucrative job at Citigroup. His wife was on the verge of leaving him. He had spent decades trying to predict what made a racehorse great with no success. And then he built the world's first EKG to measure the internal organs of horses, to measure how big different organs inside horses were. And he measured many, many organs, including the chambers of the heart, including their left ventricles. And he put this in the computer, the size of the horse's left ventricles, and he found out this did work. The size of left ventricles was a massive predictor of horse success, the biggest predictor anybody had ever found of how well a horse performed. That horses with big left ventricles did much better. So that brings us back to American Pharoah, and this is American Pharoah when he was 1 year old. Sater showed me this card he had about American Pharoah. He has cards on all his horses. American Pharoah didn't have unusually big height, 56th percentile. He wasn't unusually heavy, 61st percentile. His pedigree, his father, mother, grandparents, siblings, nothing particularly remarkable, 70th percentile. But American Pharoah's left ventricle was 99.61st percentile left ventricle, one of the biggest left ventricle he'd ever seen, and the biggest left ventricle he'd ever seen without a disease causing it. So he made this prediction based on based on his model that American Pharoah wasn't just a once every year horse or a once every decade horse. It was a once in a generation horse. And actually, I recently reached out to him about Justify, the other horse that recently won a Triple Crown. He said he also had an enormous left ventricle. So that's a pretty neat story. What lessons can we take as data scientists from Jeff Sater's story? And I think there are 4 lessons that I take from this story. The first lesson is frequently the value of a data set is not its size, it's its newness. I think companies now are obsessed with big data size. How many terabytes do you have? How many observations do you have? Do you have 5 billion observations, 10 billion observations? Jeff Sater's brilliant prediction was based on only tens of thousands of observations. It fit very neatly into an Excel spreadsheet, but it still worked because he had something new that nobody else had. Winners in the world of big data tend to be entrepreneurial. So every other horse consultant is in some sense a data scientist, but they just use the data that they're given, the height, the weight, the pedigree. Jeff Sater's secret was to go out and get more data than anybody else had to get these new sources of data. And winners in the world of big data fail a lot on their way to a big winner. So you don't just wake up with the left ventricle. You have to measure the nostril size and the fast twitch muscles and the poop. As silly as it is, you have to do all these things on the way to finding your successful predictor. And then I think what's more exciting is there really are left ventricles out there. So there are things that if you know that about your business or your customers or your industry, if you have one variable, that may make your model not 2% better, not 5% better, maybe 10 times better than everybody else's model. So that's really exciting as data scientists to think that if you are entrepreneurial, if you are willing to fail, you can eventually get some source of data that just dramatically improves your model relative to everybody else's. So I kind of leave people in the corporate world, what are the left ventricles waiting to be found? What's the left ventricle of your industry? And kind of go about finding that. All right, but most of us don't study horses, we study human beings. And when you study human beings, you have to keep in mind that human beings tend to lie. That's the theme of my research. And for the past 80 years, the method to understand human beings, if you want to know what they're thinking, what they're going to do, if you're doing market research, you have one main approach. You conduct a survey. You ask them questions, right? So Gallup or Pew or some other organization will give them a form or call them on the phone or now maybe do it on the internet and ask them various questions. But there's a big problem with this main approach to research, which is that people lie to surveys. They tend not to tell the survey what they're really thinking, what they're really going to do. They tend to tell the survey what they think will impress the other person or make them sound good. So we know this. We compare data from surveys to actual data. So for example, if you compare, and I find this shocking, if you compare immediately after an election, people who said in a survey, I voted, and you compare that to administrative records on who actually voted in the election, more than 50% of people who didn't vote lie and tell the survey that they voted. They want to tell us, they want the survey to think, of course, I exercise my civic duty, I'm a good citizen, right? So that's kind of a shocking level of deception in the direction of making people sound good, not telling the truth. And my favorite example, it's a little R-rated for maybe a Luma Connect, but maybe it'll spice up our happy hour a little bit. It's a question on sexual behavior. This is from the General Social Survey. The University of Chicago, every year they asked American men and women how frequently they have sex, whether it's heterosexual, homosexual sex, and whether they use a condom. And you do the math, women say they average heterosexual sex once a week. They use a condom 20% of the time. You do the math, women are saying they use 1.1 billion condoms every year in heterosexual sexual encounters. You do the same question, but you ask men, and they report 1.6 billion condoms every year in heterosexual sexual encounters. Does everybody see, by definition, those have to be the same? So we already know that there's some deception here, that somebody's not telling the truth about their sexual behavior. So who's telling the truth, men or women? I asked for data from Nielsen on how many condoms are sold every year in the United States. Only 600 million condoms are sold every year. Some of them used by gay men and some of them thrown out. So basically now everybody's lying about sex, men just more than women. But we now have, that should say new method. We now have a new method to understand the human psyche that I think is revolutionary, and that's people's Google searches. And I've been studying this data. I started during my PhD program and continued working at Google. I've been doing it for a few years. Where people tell Google things, they kind of confess their secrets. They tell Google things that they might not tell anybody else. They might not tell their friends, their family members, their partners, surveys. It serves as what I call digital truth serum. And when you analyze this Google search data, you get a very interesting view of the human psyche and different from the one you see in surveys. So for example, there are more searches every year for porn than for weather on Google, even though if you ask people in a survey, fewer than 20% of people admit that they watch porn. Presumably everybody admits in a survey that they check the weather, right? So it's a different view, and I think in many ways a more accurate view of the human psyche from Google searches. And Google Trends, a tool that I use, over and over again is proven better than surveys in understanding people. When we have some sort of ground truth, frequently the data from Google is more accurate than the data from surveys because people are lying in surveys. So a few examples: predicting who will turn out to vote in an election. I said if you ask people in a survey, are you going to vote? Everyone says, yeah, of course, I always vote, no problem. Actually, and this doesn't correspond with whether they actually vote. Actually, if you analyze Google searches in an area, how to vote, where to vote, in the weeks before an election, highly predictive of how many people actually turn out to vote in an election. This one's a sad one, but an important one. I've been doing research on suicide. You can predict with pretty high accuracy from searches such as how to commit suicide, suicidal, sad searches, and maybe not surprising, but important. These searches correlate highly and much higher than surveys with how many people in an area commit suicide in a given time period. And measuring racism, this is how I started my research in with Google data. So if you ask people in a survey in the United States, are you racist? Pretty much nobody says yes to that question, right? It's considered socially unacceptable, or at least it used to be considered socially unacceptable, to admit that you're racist in the United States. But I was shocked by how many people make racist searches on Google. So this is the percent of Google searches in an area that includes the N-word. They're not typing the N-word, they're typing the actual word. And people make this search with the same frequency in the United States. They search migraine and Lakers and Economist, millions of these searches every year. Again, nobody's telling surveys that they're making these searches. And what are these searches? They're not for rap lyrics. Rap lyrics tend to use the version that ends in A, not ER. These are almost all for jokes mocking and humiliating African Americans. Again, millions of these searches every year. And the map of racism was very different than the map I would have expected. If you had asked me where is racism highest in the United States, based on everything I knew from my high school classes on American history, I'd say south, 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 right? We think of racism as being a southern issue. And there is many of the areas where racism is highest. Darker red means more racism, includes southern Louisiana and southern Mississippi. But right up there near the top of racism using this Google measure are places like western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio, upstate New York. The actual divide, I think if you have to divide the country, and data is never neat, as we all know, if you had to divide the country to two regions, the divide of racism these days in the United States is less north versus south. It's more east versus west. You see how it gets a lot lighter as you get to the western part of the United States. And this map started to predict a lot of behaviors I was measuring. So places where racism is higher were less likely to support Barack Obama than previous Democratic candidates. Places where racism are higher, African Americans have worse life outcomes. They're more likely to say they experience discrimination. They're more likely to have worse health outcomes. They're more likely to have lower wages. So it's correlating with a lot of things. And then very recently, we had a presidential election where one of the candidates said some things that I found at least a little racist, where he claimed that Barack Obama wasn't born in this country, and he retweeted false statistics about African American crime. And he didn't repudiate support from David Duke. So people asked me, could you use this racism measure on Google? Would this explain why Donald Trump is doing very well, even though he's saying all these things that we thought would have ruined the presidential candidate? And this is actually from Nate Silver and Nate Cohn of the 538 New York Times, using that data I'd collected. They found the single biggest predictor of Donald Trump's support in the Republican primary, more than economic variables or trade variables or demographic variables or attitudes, anything they could find, was this measure of racism on Google. So, again, data is never 100% perfect, but this is a pretty high correlation. And it's not something picked up in surveys or any other method, but clearly there was a secret racism in the United States that was being missed by all these data sources that was really drawn to Donald Trump, which wouldn't have been revealed by other methods, but was revealed by some of these new internet data sources. Have I been controversial enough in my keynote address? I'm not saying all Trump voters are racist. I'm just saying there was a correlation, and it did drive some of his support. So, there aren't any Trump supporters in this room, are there? I don't know. Okay. All right, but one thing I keep in mind as we think through big data and data science, all big data is not the same. So everyone loves big data now. They throw around these, gets all excited. Big data, I got new big data, I got this great data set. And you do have to keep in mind the quality of this data set. How good is this data? So I said that Google searches, I think, are revolutionary data set, digital truth serum. People are really, really honest. They're telling things that they're not telling anybody else. But compare that to maybe the other biggest data set that exists on human beings right now. That would be Facebook data. I don't think that's digital truth serum. I think Facebook is digital brag to my friends about how good my life is serum, right? Because on Facebook, unlike on Google, people aren't honest. They're even more dishonest than surveys. They're trying to present an image of themselves to their friends, a public image of themselves, instead of privately looking for information. And you have to be cautious. And is this data really reflecting who they are, or is this reflecting who they want you to think they are? And I've actually done a lot of studies and found over and over again that Facebook data doesn't correspond with reality. So this is one example about Facebook data being inaccurate. Compare two magazines, the Atlantic Monthly and the National Enquirer. So the Atlantic Monthly is a highbrow, serious, intellectual magazine. It has poetry and political theory and philosophy. The National Enquirer is a lowbrow, celebrity, trashy magazine. We can compare these two magazines, how popular they actually are in the United States. We have data on actual copies purchased of these two magazines. And it turns out in the United States, the National Enquirer is 3 times more popular than the Atlantic Monthly. People are 3 times more likely to purchase the National Enquirer than the Atlantic Monthly. But what happens on Facebook when people are bragging to their friends? Do people think the National Enquirer is still so popular? Not quite, right? So on Facebook, the Atlantic Monthly is actually more popular according to what people like. It's in fact 45 times more popular because everyone wants their friends to think they're so intellectual, right? Nobody wants to admit they're secretly reading the National Enquirer. And you can compare these two big data sets. Facebook, the digital brag to my friends about how good my life is serum, where people are dishonest, and Google, the digital truth serum, where people are more honest. So one of my favorite comparisons, I compared the same topic, how people describe their husbands on the two different data sources, the public Facebook and the private Google. So top descriptions of husbands start with social media posts. When people are posting on Facebook, my husband is. What do people think the number one way people complete my husband is on Facebook is? Perfect. Amazing. The best. Close enough, right? The best is number 1 on Facebook. Number 2 is my best friend. Number 3, amazing. Number 4, the greatest. And number 5, so cute. So that's marriage according to social media, which is, I would say, an interesting view of marriage. What happens on Google search when people are by themselves? Do we get the same view of marriage when people are typing my husband is on Google? And it turns out the third most popular way people complete the phrase my husband is on Google is the same as on social media. It's also amazing, which I found the most shocking, because why are you telling Google my husband is amazing? Like, right? Like, what are they gonna do for you in this situation? Like, congratulations. But rounding out the top 5 on Google are gay, a jerk, annoying, and mean. So that's the different view of marriage on social media, public, and search, private. But an important way to use any big data, so whether it's Google, Facebook, anytime you have a big data set, one real power of the data set is you can zoom in closely on a population. And that's really, really important and can give you new information that you wouldn't otherwise get. So this is my favorite example. This is a map put together by the New York Times based on Facebook likes. And people on Facebook in every county, they say what baseball team they like. And the New York Times, working with Facebook data scientists, put together a map of which baseball team is most popular in every corner of the United States based on this Facebook data set. And again, I say Facebook data set is frequently inaccurate, but I'm assuming on baseball teams, people aren't too embarrassed to announce their allegiance, even if they're a Phillies fan. But no. Okay, but when you do this map, for example, you can compare. Compares the Red Sox and Yankees fans. You can see zooming in really, really closely on the exact point in Connecticut where the Red Sox become more popular than the Yankees and the border between these two teams. You can do that for every team. And the amazing thing about this data set is if you imagined a survey of, let's say, 2,000 people, you might have, and you ask people, 2,000 people, what's your favorite baseball team, you may have 10 people from Connecticut, right? And in any town in Connecticut, you're going to have no people. But because Facebook dataset has everybody, because it's such an enormous dataset, it has 160 million Americans, for every corner of the United States, it has meaningful information on the favorite baseball team. And then A/B testing, obviously a really, really important tool in big data analysis, still used more and more, but still underutilized, and really, really powerful to get the best version of your website up to customers. This is an example I like from the Boston Globe. The Boston Globe A/B tests every headline they do. So for every story they write, they'll make 2 headlines. The journalist will come up with 2 headlines, then they'll show one version to one small group of users and one version to another small group of users. And then they'll figure out which one gets the most clicks and then show that version to everybody. So why is A/B testing so powerful? A/B testing is so powerful because it's very hard to guess what people are going to do without actually measuring it. So I'll give you a headline test and see if you can win. This is directly from the Boston Globe actual A/B test they did. The same story, they had 2 headlines. One was when the first subway opened in Boston. The other was cartoons from when the first subway opened in Boston. Again, A/B tested this headline. Who thinks, I'll see if you can guess the winner, who thinks when the first subway opened in Boston, the one on the left is the more popular headline? Okay, guy with the LA Dodgers hat thinks that's the winner. You're either a genius or making a fool of yourself, but we'll see. Who thinks cartoons from when the first subway opened in Boston is the winner? Everybody else. Okay, the LA Dodgers hat guy was the, congratulations. So the winner is actually 60% more clicks from when the first subway opened in Boston. So think about the power of A/B testing, that everybody except for this gentleman, if they had made the decision based on themselves, would have chosen the headline when the first cartoons from when the first subway opened in Boston, and you would have lost 60% higher clicks than you would have gotten by A/B testing it. All right, these are fun. You want another one? Another one? Okay. Can the SnotBot drone save the whales, or can this drone save the whales? Same story, Boston Globe, A/B tested. Who thinks can the SnotBot drone save the whales is the winner? Okay, this one's closer, I think. And who thinks can this drone save the whales is the winner? Majority. All right, the winner is can the SnotBot drone save the whales? So again, like no matter who you are, I've never seen any person. Some people get like 2 or 3 right, but then by the 4th one they're wrong, and they think, oh, I don't need A/B testing, and then the 4th one comes and they get it wrong. So no matter who you are, I think over and over again you find that your intuition's never perfect, and you really need to do these rapid data experimentations to get the winners. All right, so one final story I want to tell about data is maybe a more, so I think if I've done, the analyses I've said have more been describing the world. So here's where racism is highest, or here's where baseball teams are more popular. But I think ultimately we can use data to change the world, to improve the world. So this is a study I did on Islamophobia, or really anti-Muslim attitudes. And it turns out that some people make on Google, not a huge number, but not a trivial number either, make some really disturbing searches on Google. They search things like kill Muslims, I hate Muslims, Muslims must die, really, really nasty, crazy stuff on Google. And these searches are so weird. Again, why are you telling Google that? What's going to happen? But you might say, okay, who even cares that a couple thousand Americans in a given month are going to make these searches? Well, it turns out if you do a model on these searches and you compare these to hate crimes against Muslims, when these searches are higher, there are more hate crimes against Muslims. So when more people are searching kill Muslims, or I hate Muslims, or Muslims must die, there are more people beating up Muslims, attacking mosques, even sometimes killing Muslims. So these searches are highly predictive of really nasty attitudes. And there was one period where Islamophobic searches, these anti-Muslim searches, went way up. It was after, how many people remember the San Bernardino attack in California, December 2015? Yeah, so you guys remember? Okay, so it was basically these 2 people with Muslim American sounding names, and they were Muslim Americans, shot up and killed 14 of their coworkers. And immediately, you can actually break down on Google Trends minute by minute data, and you see as soon as they announced the suspects' names and they were Muslim sounding, explosion of nasty searches of Muslims. So tons of people saying, kill these Muslims, Muslims die, I hate Muslims. And again, this suggested, based on our modeling, that there were going to be more hate crimes against Muslims in the coming days from all these angry people. So a few days later, after the San Bernardino attack, I think Barack Obama, either using Google Trends or maybe just talking to people or talking to his advisors, this is when Barack Obama was president, knew that there was a problem in the United States, that anti-Muslim attitudes were getting a little out of control, and he wanted to give a speech to deal with this. And he gave a nationally televised speech. It gave a lot of attention about anti-Muslim attitudes. And the speech, I was a big Barack Obama fan, but the speech was, I thought, Barack Obama at his best. Like really poetic, really beautiful, really moving. He talked about how it's the responsibility of all Americans of every faith to reject discrimination, how it's our responsibility to not appeal to fear, to appeal to freedom, how it's our responsibility to love everybody no matter their religious background. And I liked the speech. Everybody I knew liked the speech. All the serious sources gave it rave reviews. The Boston Globe said great speech. LA Times, great speech. Newsweek, New York Times, great speech. So I wanted to see, this Google search data is broken down minute by minute. I wanted to see, did Barack Obama's speech work? When he was giving this this seemingly moving speech, what happened to these nasty searches about Muslim Americans? And I found out the anti-Muslim searches during and for hours after his speech, they didn't drop. They didn't even stay the same. They went way up. So there were way more people searching kill Muslims and I hate Muslims and no Syrian refugees, and fewer positive searches, fewer people saying how to help Syrian refugees or how to help Muslims. Or it was just seemed like everything Obama was doing was, even though everybody said it was great, was backfiring. So that's kind of a depressing conclusion, that a speech that we thought was really doing a good job is actually doing a bad job and actually making people angrier. But there was maybe a little more optimistic conclusion. So at the end of the speech, he had a different line. He said that we have to remember that Muslim Americans are our friends and neighbors. They're our sports heroes, and they're the men and women who will die for our country. And immediately after he gives this line, you see an explosion of searches for Muslim athletes and Muslim soldiers. And for the first time in many years, the top descriptor of Muslim on Google wasn't Muslim extremist or Muslim terrorist. It was Muslim athletes followed by Muslim soldiers, and they kept the top spot for days afterwards. And you see all around the internet these young men who were the greatest risk of having these anti-Muslim attitudes. They're saying, Shaquille O'Neal's Muslim? Muhammad Ali's Muslim? Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's Muslim? They're kind of like shocked, and it's not, again, curiosity, it's not clear that, it's a first step. It's not clear that all of a sudden they're going to change their attitudes, but it was like the people most at risk of having these anti-Muslim attitudes are now going around the internet trying to make sense of this new fact that they weren't aware of about Muslim Americans. So we published this finding. I write an occasional column in the New York Times, and we published this finding. And we said there's two strategies that Obama used, one of which seemed not to work and one of which seemed to work. So what didn't work? What didn't work is using words like responsibility, telling people what they should do, lecturing them, giving them information they've been told 1,000 times. Every time you do that, they seem to just get angrier and angrier. But what does work is maybe provoking their curiosity, giving them new information, changing the way they think about this group that's causing them so much rage. So we published this finding in the New York Times, and I don't think it's totally insane when you write a New York Times column that powerful people read it, maybe even someone in Obama's office. Because a couple weeks later, Obama gave another speech. This time it was in a Baltimore mosque. And again, it was trying to calm down Islamophobia. Again, it was on national TV. Again, it got an enormous amount of attention. But Obama's strategy in this speech was totally different. He didn't use the word responsibility once. He didn't tell people what they should do. Instead, he doubled down or tripled down on this curiosity strategy. So he said how Muslim Americans helped to build our nation, how Thomas Jefferson had a copy of the Quran, and how the first mosque was in North Dakota, and how Muslim Americans built the skyscrapers of Chicago, and Muslim Americans are athletes and soldiers and farmers and merchants, and really, really just saying all these things about Muslim Americans and people not changing the view of them that they might not have known, and making them think of Muslim Americans in different ways than just these terrorists who had committed this horrible act. And we looked at the anti-Muslim searches on Google in the minutes and hours and days after this speech, and we found that most of them actually dropped. So I'm not saying from our 2 little studies that we've solved hatred in the world. Obviously, a lot more research has to be done on this topic, but I think it does show the enormous power of some of these new data tools, where by the fact that people are so honest, they're telling things like, I want to kill Muslims or I hate Muslims, and you have these enormous numbers zoomed down minute by minute in tiny towns, you can really go after these big, difficult questions. You can turn something as seemingly as chaotic as how to calm an angry mob into much more of a science. So that's my little spiel. My book is Everybody Lies, where I talk about this and much more. But now I think, Tasha, do we have a few more minutes? Or a few more minutes. If there are any questions, I'll answer. I'll take questions from the audience. Yeah.
So that's a great coverage of this, but I'm focused on what you were saying about Facebook and Google on the husbands thing. Isn't there a bit of a danger in framing it that way? Google would be about solving a problem, and Facebook is the brag thing, where they're not going to ask advice necessarily. So aren't the populations kind of
I think it's right. So it's a good question. Did everyone hear the question, by the way? Okay. So the question is, you compared the husbands on how people describe husbands on Facebook and Google, and I was kind of presenting it as Facebook is lying and Google is really, really honest, whereas maybe it's just different because if your husband's my best, if your husband does something great, you don't feel the need to tell Google, you feel the need to tell Facebook. So it's kind of just a different population. And I think it's definitely true. I don't want you to take from that Google's that the right view of marriage is the Google one, or the Facebook one is the wrong view of marriage. I do think, just based on my own personal experiences, that Google's a little closer than Facebook, but no. But I think it's just to keep in mind that the data you get depends on the incentives you give people, right? So I think a lot of people tend to trust if it's data, then it's a completely accurate representative view of something, right? So you look at the Facebook measures of marriage and you say, that's how people describe their husbands. These are the top 5 descriptors of husbands. Well, no, it's the top 5 descriptors when people are broadcasting it to their friends, and when people are by themselves, the top 5 descriptors are very different. So it's always to keep in mind. You always have to keep in mind that the data you get is going to be influenced by the incentives you give people.
Could I follow up?
Yeah.
But do you have methodology to understand those different contexts, or to know that those contexts will affect what you're actually trying to research between there? Because there is that kind of that meta level issue of why they might use a particular.
Yes. So I think So again, the question is kind of think through. When do you want to use one particular data source? When's one data source better, one data set's worse? So I think the way I think about it is Google, I think, is in general more accurate because people are trying to get information. And when you look at the correlations, frequently Google searches correlate better with ground truth than Facebook data sets. So if you look at Google searches for National Enquirer versus Atlantic Monthly, they're much more likely to be closer to the sales data, right? But I think Facebook is aspirational. So if you're advertising and you want to appeal to people's better selves, and they're in the mood to present their better selves, then you may want to rely more on Facebook data sets. So it's not always that one's better or one's worse, but that's the way I kind of divide the 2 data sources. Other questions? All right, well, thanks. Enjoy the rest of the conference.